The Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword first released for the Nintendo Wii in 2011, and much like Metroid Other M, this game initially got a lot of hate when it was first released, but I remember enjoying it. Although, also like Metroid Other M, I haven't really played it since it first came out about 10 years ago, and that's really mostly because around 2012 or so I just got really tired of motion controls. But now there's an HD version available on the Switch that makes the motion controls completely optional, so I thought now would be a good time to go back and play through this game to see if this new version might be better than the original. And before we get started, if you enjoy this video, please let me know by giving it a thumbs up and tell me about it in the comments down below. That sort of thing really helps me out a lot. Subscribe to the channel if you're new here, I upload every other Saturday. Follow me on Twitter, I will leave a link to that in the description. And now let's get into it. Skyward Sword is the first game in the Zelda timeline, and it's set long before things got weird with Ocarina of Time. The story is mostly focused on the origin of the Master Sword and the first epic story of good versus evil in the world that would eventually become the Land of Hyrule. The game starts out like most 3D Zelda games do, with Link sleeping. He's woken up by a Loftwing who drops off a letter from Zelda reminding him that they had arranged to meet before the Wing Ceremony. And the Wing Ceremony is basically just a race between students at the Academy, with the prize of getting to be part of a ritual in honor of the goddess Hylia, alongside with Zelda. After the race and the ritual, Zelda and Link go for a bit of a joyride on their Loftwings. While they're flying around, a vortex erupts from the clouds and swallows up Zelda, which starts our central conflict of Link doing everything that he can to rescue Zelda from the clutches of the evil Demon King Girahim. The relationship between Link and Zelda is the center point of the plot, and it's very different from other Zelda games because Zelda isn't a princess in this one. She's just Link's friend from childhood. Link really isn't in this quest to save the world, that's just a bonus. He's really in this to save his friend, and it makes this relationship much more memorable and a lot more meaningful than most other Link and Zelda relationships. Another memorable relationship in this game is the friendship that forms between Link and Groose. At first the relationship is very adversarial because Groose has a boner for Zelda, and he's jealous of the time that she and Link spend together. As the story progresses, he eventually comes around and becomes a valued ally to Link. He even helps out with a couple of boss fights. Clearly he does care about Zelda and he wants to do the right thing. He's only a jerk to Link in the beginning because he's a horny teenager who can't control his emotions very well yet. After Zelda gets swallowed up by the vortex, Link finds the Goddess Sword along with Fi, an AI construct created by the goddess Hylia to be a guide for the chosen hero. The original version of the game was heavily criticized for the way that Fi would basically hold the player's hand throughout the game, and sometimes even straight up give the solutions to the puzzles. But there is much less of that in the HD version, and you can almost entirely ignore Fi and her hints. The hints are largely unnecessary anyway, because most of the dungeon puzzles in this game are actually pretty easy, but I don't mean that in a bad way. It's just that the main challenge here is really in the combat. And the overall dungeon design in this game is superb. As much as I love Breath of the Wild, it is pretty nice to go back to playing some regular as Zelda and go through some real fucking dungeons. It takes a little while to get there, but the first dungeon is the Skyview Temple, which is this game's obligatory forest dungeon. But instead of a lush, vibrant green forest, this one is dead and decaying with a much darker color scheme than we usually see for this sort of thing. The boss of this dungeon is Girahim, the central antagonist who's trying to use Zelda to resurrect his master Demise, and he's the first real test of combat. In the first stage of the fight, he will hold up his hand and use it to block most of your sword attacks. You will have to use the tip of your sword to draw his hand to one side, and then quickly strike from the opposite side. After a while, Girahim will take out his own sword, and during this stage, he will also occasionally shoot projectiles at you, which you can deflect with your sword. For the most part, all you really have to do here is just avoid his attacks and hit him when you get an opening. And this is as good of a time as any to talk about the controls. Back in the day, I really got into the whole motion control thing. I was one of those people saying things like, oh, with the PS3 and Xbox 360 you're still just pushing buttons like we've been doing for decades. The Wii is changing how video games are played. But then, by the time the Wii U came out, I was totally over it. In 2012, I just couldn't bring myself to give a shit anymore. And that's why I'm really glad that this version of the game also has button controls so that you don't have to put up with motion controls if you don't want to. I played pretty much the entire game with the button controls. The sword is controlled with the right analog stick, And at first I tried using a sweeping motion with my thumb to sort of mimic the movement of the sword, but I quickly found that using a flicking motion is way more effective. If you press the L button, the right stick will start to control the camera, and this can take a little bit of getting used to since the right stick basically has two functions, but the original version didn't have any camera control at all, outside of using Z targeting to center the camera behind Link. A little while ago, I was talking to a friend who never played the original Wii version of the game at all. I don't think the guy even owned a Wii ever. But he decided to check out the Switch version of this game, and as he was playing it using the button controls, he mostly just used the targeting to keep the camera centered behind Link and almost entirely ignored using the stick to control the camera. But since I did play the original version, having any sort of camera control at all feels like a godsend to me. I can't tell you how much easier this made the game's 4 stealth sections called the Silent Realms. In these areas, you have to collect all the sacred tears without any of your gear and while avoiding every enemy. A lot of people really don't like these sections, but I never really thought of them as a very big deal. They've just never been that hard for me to get through. There was only one part where I tried out the motion controls, and it was while I was going through the Linero Desert for the first time. And it quickly reminded me of why I got tired of motion controls to begin with. The central mechanic of this area are these timeshift stones that transport the local area to the distant past. There are also these electrified hermit crabs that will basically be taken back to their larval state while under the influence of the timeshift stones. While they are like this, they will occasionally electrify their bodies, which will harm Link if he's holding one. There's a couple of puzzles in this area where you have to roll these little guys into a slot so that their electricity can power up a generator. And this was such a pain in the ass to do with motion controls. To get Link to roll these guys, you have to point the Joy-Con down at the floor and make a rolling motion with your wrist. I seriously died twice from having these guys electrocute me while I argued with Link about whether or not I did the right motions. Maybe this would be easier to do if I was sitting in an actual gaming chair rather than my lazy boy recliner. But once I switched back to the button controls, I got this on my first try and never went back to the motion controls. Speaking of the Linero Desert, the sand ship has to be my favorite dungeon of the entire game. There is one central timeshift stone that you have to hit at different locations to go back and forth between the past and present to progress through the ship. Every dungeon has a big key that you need to find before you can fight the boss. However, unlike the previous Zelda games, these really aren't keys. They're usually some sort of object that's somehow related to the dungeon, and to open up the door for the boss room, you'll have to fit it in the door in just the right way. And this is another one of those things that I found was just way less of a pain in the ass to do with the button controls. Even though the sand ship is my favorite dungeon, my favorite boss fight is the one for the previous dungeon. In the Ancient Cistern, you go up against Koloktos, and the item that you find in this dungeon is the whip, which you can use to rip off Koloktos' arms. In the first stage of the fight, you will have to rip his arms off until his weak point is open, and then slash at it with your sword. In the second stage, he will start to guard that weak point, and what you'll have to do now is keep ripping his arms off until he starts dropping his massive swords, which you can pick up to use against him. And overall, this is a very satisfying fight to do. I don't really want to go into every dungeon and every boss fight because that could take a while, but I will say that there really isn't much variety in the boss fights. There are a lot of them, but we fight both Girahim and the imprisoned avocado 3 times each. And every time you fight them, they do change things up enough that they sort of feel like a different fight, but neither of the fights against the avocado are any fun at all. Each time you fight him, you basically have to slash at his little toesy woesies until he falls over, so that you can drive the spike back into his head. He can take steps that are powered with electricity, and they will shock you if you're too close to him when his feet come down. And this makes the whole process of hitting his toes a major pain in the dick balls. Sometimes when he falls over, his body will block the way back to his head, which forces you down to the lower level so that you can go around him. This can take up a lot of time, and if you don't drive that spike back into his skull fast enough, he'll get right back up, which makes all the time that you spent going around him feel like a complete waste. The game is very linear, and the overworld is broken up into 3 sections: the Faron Woods, the Elden Volcano, and the Linero Desert. These 3 areas aren't connected to each other in any way, and the sky sort of acts as a hub world for these areas. You visit each overworld area 3 times throughout the story. First time you're looking for Zelda, second time you're looking for the sacred flames to turn the goddess sword into the master sword, and the third time you're looking for the parts of the Song of the Hero, which Link needs to learn before he can find the Triforce. The third time that you go into the Faron Woods, the entire area is flooded and Link will have to be catapulted in, and I love that he's just all for it. His reaction is basically just, yeah, whatever, I've done crazier shit on this adventure already, let's do this catapult thing. Before you can learn the first part of the Song of the Hero, you'll have to collect these Tadtones that are scattered all throughout the flooded Faron Woods. In the original version of the game, the swimming was done with motion controls, and this is another situation where being able to use the button controls made this whole thing so much less of a pain in the ass to do. Every section of the overworld feels very different from the other ones, and each section also has its own race of NPCs for Link to interact with. In the Faron Woods, we have the Kikwis, who are all just so adorable and I want one for a pet. Around the Eldin Volcano, you'll run into the Mogba people, who are all named after different types of rock, which is very cute. And then in the Linero Desert, we have these robots who are part of the old mining operations. There is one robot who helps you out more than the rest, and his name is Scrapper. When you find him, he offers to help you lift heavy objects between the overworld and the sky. And I love this little guy. He constantly calls Link Master Shortpants, and he insists that he is the goddess's chosen hero. And to be honest, I'm inclined to agree. Link would have never been able to complete this journey without him. By the time you're going to these overworld areas for the third time, it sort of starts to feel a little bit repetitive. Luckily, there are a lot of side quests to do between these visits to the overworld. Most of them revolve around helping out a monster named Batro who just wants to be everyone's friend. Once I met this guy, I don't know why, but I immediately felt compelled to help him. He is hoping that if he can collect enough gratitude crystals, he can turn into a human. Gratitude crystals are crystals that are literally made with the gratitude that people feel after Link helps them. But when I got to be about halfway through the game or so, I decided that I should stay focused on the story so that I could kind of move on to other projects sooner. So, sorry Batro, you're stuck like that. In addition to these gratitude crystal side quests, there are also these goddess cubes that you will find hidden throughout the overworld. Hitting one of these cubes with the Skyward Strike will unlock a treasure chest somewhere up in the sky. Finding these cubes and getting close enough to hit them can be pretty challenging at times, but towards the end of the game, you'll get the ability to track them down with Vi's dowsing ability, which makes finding them pretty trivial. This was the first Zelda game to use a live orchestra for the soundtrack, and it makes a big difference. This is probably my favorite Zelda soundtrack of all time. I actually got the collector's edition of the original version of the game back in the day, which came with the soundtrack CD. Unfortunately, I lost that CD in a car crash, but I used to love listening to it on my way to work. It made me feel like every day started with an adventure. This game really follows in the tradition of Zelda games with incredible music. I also really like the way that this game looks. It sort of combines the cel shading of Wind Waker along with the more realistic designs of Twilight Princess, giving us the best of both worlds. The HD version runs at a smooth and consistent 60 frames per second, and it looks like some of the textures have been updated as well. Overall, this is a very pretty looking game. Finishing a Zelda game is always a very satisfying experience for me, and this game was no different. I don't think I can really say that this is my favorite 3D Zelda game. That honor probably still goes to Ocarina of Time, but that doesn't mean this is a game that Zelda fans should ignore. It adds a lot to the overall lore of the series, and the HD version is way less of a pain in the ass to play. If you've never played this before, the Switch version is definitely the better version, and it is absolutely worth your time to play through it. Thanks for watching, and I hope to see you next time.